April 15, 1944. North Atlantic. 0847 hours. A 65-pound bomb punched through the freezing ocean at terminal velocity and slammed into the pressure hull of U-448 at 200 feet below the surface. The explosion ripped the submarine open like a knife through tin foil. Seawater crushed inward at 90 pounds per square inch. 44 German sailors died before their brains could register what was happening. Their screams lasted less than 2 seconds. The steel coffin folded in half and spiraled into the abyss. On the surface, Commander James Rowley of HMS Swale pulled off his headphones and stared at the officer next to him. He had heard 3 sharp cracks, not the familiar thunder of depth charges, something else. Something he had never heard before in 3 years of hunting submarines. Something final. 16 minutes later, a second submarine died the same way. 11 minutes after that, a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, then a sixth, then a seventh. By 0917 hours, 7 German Type 7 submarines lay crushed on the ocean floor. 231 men dead. Total elapsed time from first contact to last kill, 30 minutes. The weapon that killed them was called the Hedgehog, and the man who designed it was not an admiral, not a general, not even a soldier. He was a civilian engineer named Charles Goodeve, who had never fired a gun in combat, never commanded a warship, never worn a military uniform with any real authority. This is the story of how one man's ridiculous idea changed submarine warfare forever, saved 20,000 lives, and turned the most feared hunters in the ocean into terrified prey. But before we get there, you need to understand the nightmare that made the Hedgehog necessary. Rewind to 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire Second World War. It started on September 3, 1939, the very first day Britain declared war on Germany, and it would not end until the last day of the conflict in 1945. 6 years of relentless killing in the coldest, most violent waters on Earth. Picture this. You are a merchant sailor on a cargo ship crossing from New York to Liverpool. Your vessel is one of 50 in a convoy sailing in tight formation through waves that tower 50 feet high. The North Atlantic in winter is a frozen hell. Winds scream at gale force. Sleet reduces visibility to nothing. The temperature hovers below freezing, and the spray that hits your face feels like broken glass. You wear a life preserver 24 hours a day, because you know that if a torpedo strikes, you will have seconds to jump into water so cold it stops your heart in minutes. You are not a soldier. You are a stevedore, a fisherman, an ordinary seaman from Liverpool or Halifax or Cape Town. You are in your 40s, maybe your 50s. Too old for the infantry. Too young to sit at home while your country starves. So you haul cargo across an ocean that wants to kill you, knowing that somewhere beneath those black waves, German U-boats are stalking your ship like wolves circling a wounded animal. You cannot see them. You cannot hear them. You only know they are there when a torpedo slams into the ship beside yours, and the night fills with fire and screaming men. In 1942, German U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships. That is more than 4 ships every single day. 6 million tons of cargo sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Food that would never feed British families. Oil that would never fuel British tanks. Ammunition that would never reach British soldiers fighting in North Africa. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. If the convoy routes were cut, Britain would starve. The war would be lost, and democracy itself might fall. The Royal Navy threw everything it had at the problem. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates escorted every convoy. Aircraft patrolled from bases in Iceland and Newfoundland. Every warship carried ASDIC, the British version of sonar. And they had depth charges. Hundreds of thousands of depth charges. 400 pounds of high explosive dropped over the stern of a ship, sinking into darkness, detonating with a massive boom that could be heard for miles. They looked terrifying. They sounded devastating. and they were almost completely useless. In 1942, escort vessels expended an average of more than 500 depth charges for every single U-boat they managed to destroy. 500 explosions to achieve one kill. The mathematics were suicidal. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Sailors were dying faster than they could be replaced. And the reason was a flaw so fundamental, so obvious, that it seemed impossible no one had fixed it. To drop a depth charge, a warship had to sail directly over the submarine. But ASDIC sonar could only detect targets forward and downward. Directly beneath the ship was a blind spot. In the final moments of every attack, the most critical seconds when accuracy mattered most, the hunting ship went completely blind. It was like throwing a dart at a bullseye while closing your eyes for the last 3 steps. German U-boat commanders knew this weakness and exploited it with ruthless precision. The moment they heard the distinctive ping of ASDIC, they would crash, dive, change course, vary their depth. By the time depth charges detonated, the submarine was hundreds of meters away, creeping towards safety, while its hunters churned through empty, turbulent water. The Atlantic was filling with corpses, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. But everything was about to change because of a man no one in the Admiralty had ever heard of. Charles Goodeve was born in Neepawa, Manitoba, Canada in 1904. He was not supposed to be designing weapons. He was a physicist, quiet, methodical, precise. Before the war, he had been working on degaussing systems, the magnetic countermeasures that protected ships from German mines. He was the kind of man who looked at problems sideways rather than head-on. The kind of man who asked why before asking how. The kind of man the Royal Navy had absolutely no use for until the day it desperately needed him. In 1941, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development gave Goodeve an assignment that sounded like a joke. Develop an anti-submarine weapon that could be fired forward from an attacking ship. The career officers in the room laughed. Fire forward. That contradicted everything the Royal Navy knew about submarine warfare. Depth charges were dropped from the stern. That was doctrine. That was tradition. That was how the British Navy had done it since 1916, and that was how it would always be done. Goodeve did not laugh. He did not argue about tradition. He went back to his laboratory and did what he always did. He looked at the mathematics, and the mathematics said something extraordinary. If a ship could fire weapons forward while still tracking a submarine on ASDIC, there would be no blind spot, no guesswork, no desperate hope that the target had not moved. The kill probability would increase by a factor of 6. The solution he proposed sounded insane. Instead of one massive 400-pound depth charge, he wanted to fire 24 small bombs in an oval pattern ahead of the ship. Each bomb would weigh only 65 pounds. And here was the part that made admirals choke on their tea. The bombs would not explode at a preset depth like depth charges. They would only detonate on direct contact with a submarine's hull. The reaction was immediate and brutal. You want to throw 24 tiny bombs into the ocean and hope one hits. What happens to the 23 that miss? They just sink to the bottom and do nothing. Goodeve's answer was pure mathematics. The pattern would cover an area 100 feet in diameter. A Type 7 U-boat was 67 feet long and 20 feet wide. If ASDIC contact was maintained right up to the moment of firing, the probability of at least one bomb striking the hull was remarkably high. And 65 pounds of Torpex explosive detonating in direct contact with a pressure hull would punch through it like a can opener. No submarine could survive that. The admirals were not convinced. They wanted bigger explosions, more destructive power, more noise and fury. Goodeve wanted precision. The argument consumed months. Senior officers called the concept ridiculous, suicidal, a waste of resources. But Goodeve had one ally more powerful than any admiral: necessity. The U-boats were winning. Something had to change. The first Hedgehog prototype was built in early 1941. 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 4 rows of 6 mounted on a steel frame on the forecastle of a ship. The entire assembly could fire in less than 3 seconds, sending 24 bombs arcing through the air in a carefully calculated elliptical pattern. The first tests were a disaster. Bombs tumbled in flight. The pattern scattered unpredictably. Contact fuses failed. Engineers added stabilizing fins and rebalanced every projectile by hand. The fuse mechanism was redesigned 5 times before reliability exceeded 90%. Training presented another nightmare. The Hedgehog demanded precise ASDIC tracking and perfect timing. Fire too early and the submarine dives under the pattern. Fire too late and it passes beyond range. Fire at the wrong angle and the entire salvo misses. Months of testing. Months of failure. Months of admirals shaking their heads and saying they told him so. By late 1942, the weapon was finally ready, and the first real kill changed everything. December 1942, the Mediterranean Sea. HMS Dorado tracked an Italian submarine for 11 minutes, maintaining continuous ASDIC contact. At optimal range, the Hedgehog fired. 24 bombs arced through the air and plunged into the water. 3 seconds of silence. Then a sound no one aboard had ever heard before. A sharp, distinctive crack. Not the rumbling boom of a depth charge. A crack. Clean. Final. Absolute. Moments later, debris and oil surfaced. The submarine was dead. More kills followed through 1943. HMS Sunflower destroyed U-952. HMS Dorado sank U-229. HMS Pelican killed U-371. Each attack followed the same devastating pattern. Track, position, fire, crack, dead submarine. The statistics were staggering. Depth charges required over 500 attempts per kill. The Hedgehog achieved kills on roughly 1 in every 4 attacks. The success rate was 6 times higher than conventional weapons. Word spread through the escort fleet like wildfire. Ships equipped with Hedgehog became the most prized assignments in the Atlantic. Crews who had spent months uselessly dropping depth charges on empty water suddenly had a weapon that actually destroyed submarines. When German naval intelligence received the first reports, they dismissed them as British propaganda. A forward-throwing bomb that only explodes on contact impossible. Admiral Karl Dönitz himself refused to believe it. His submarines were invincible. They had survived hundreds of attacks. This was a lie. It was not a lie. The mathematics of the war had changed. The blind spot was gone. The escape window was closed. And the hunters were about to become the hunted. But proving a weapon works and convincing the most powerful navy on Earth to adopt it are 2 entirely different wars. Because the man standing in Gudiv's way was not a German admiral. He was not a U-boat commander. He was Vice Admiral Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, the man responsible for protecting every convoy crossing the Atlantic. And he hated the Hedgehog. In Part 2, we will witness the brutal political war inside the Admiralty. We will stand in the room when Noble tried to kill the Hedgehog program forever. We will meet Captain Frederick Walker, the most dangerous U-boat hunter alive, who risked his entire career on a secret, unauthorized mission to prove the weapon worked. And we will see the night when 4 German submarines died in 6 hours, and the Royal Navy finally understood that everything had changed. The question was simple. Could 1 civilian engineer and 1 rogue captain force the most tradition-bound navy in the world to abandon 26 years of doctrine? The answer would determine whether Britain survived or starved. And the clock was ticking. In Part 1. Charles Gudiv, a civilian engineer who had never commanded a warship, designed a weapon that the entire Royal Navy called impossible. His Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that fired 24 contact-fused bombs, achieved a kill rate 6 times higher than depth charges. Submarines that had survived hundreds of conventional attacks were being destroyed in minutes. The concept worked. The mathematics were undeniable. The proof was sitting on admirals' desks in black and white. But here is a statistic that should make your blood boil. In the first 6 months after the Hedgehog proved its effectiveness in combat, only 12 ships in the entire Atlantic Fleet were equipped with the new weapon. 12 ships. Meanwhile, U-boats continued sinking 4 Allied vessels every single day. Thousands of merchant sailors drowned in freezing water while admirals argued about doctrine. And the man standing in Goodieve's way was not a German submarine commander. He was a British vice admiral. And this is where everything became much worse. Vice Admiral Percy Noble was 62 years old in 1942. He was commander-in-chief of Western approaches, which meant every convoy crossing the Atlantic was his responsibility. Every escort ship answered to him. Every tactical decision flowed through his headquarters in Liverpool. Noble had joined the Royal Navy in 1898. He had served in the Boxer Rebellion. He had commanded destroyers in the First World War. He had climbed through the ranks for 44 years by following established doctrine and trusting institutional wisdom. He had watched dozens of miracle weapons come and go. He had seen young engineers promise revolution and deliver nothing but wasted time and resources. In his experience, innovation was a distraction. Tradition won wars. When Goodieve requested a meeting to discuss accelerated Hedgehog deployment, Noble agreed, but not because he was interested. He agreed because he wanted to end the conversation permanently. The meeting took place in Liverpool on March 3, 1942. Noble sat behind his mahogany desk flanked by 3 senior captains in pressed uniforms. Goodieve stood alone. Noble did not offer him a seat. "I have read your reports, Mr. Goodieve. Impressive numbers. 1 kill per 4 attacks. Very impressive indeed. But I have been fighting submarines for 40 years, and I have learned something about weapons that work in theory." "Sir, this is not theory," Goodieve replied. "HMS Dorado confirmed a kill in December, HMS Sunflower in January. The weapon works in combat." Noble waved his hand dismissively. "Isolated incidents. Your weapon requires perfect ASDIC contact, perfect timing, perfect conditions. How often do we have perfect conditions in the North Atlantic? Never. That is the answer. Never. The depth charge requires the same conditions and achieves far worse results." Noble's face reddened. He stood slowly and placed both fists on the desk. "The depth charge has protected convoys for 26 years. It is proven. It is reliable. Your contraption is untested in fleet operations, and you want me to refit every escort ship in the Atlantic. Do you have any idea how many vessels would be out of service during conversion? How many convoys would sail without adequate protection? I want you to save lives, sir." The room went silent. One of the captains coughed. Nobody spoke to Vice Admiral Noble like that. Nobody. "Mr. Goodieve, you are a civilian. You design weapons. You do not understand operations. You do not understand logistics. And you certainly do not understand the Royal Navy. I am recommending that your Hedgehog program be suspended pending further review. We will revisit this matter in 18 months. 18 months. At the current sinking rate, that meant 2,000 more ships on the ocean floor, 50,000 more sailors dead. Goodieve walked out of that office knowing his career was finished. He had challenged the wrong man. The Hedgehog would gather dust in warehouses while the Atlantic filled with corpses. But Goodieve had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed he was alone. He was not. Captain Frederick John Walker was 45 years old and already the most successful U-boat hunter in the Royal Navy. His second escort group had destroyed more submarines than any other commander in the fleet. He was aggressive, unconventional, and completely uninterested in what admirals thought about his methods. Walker had heard about the Hedgehog through unofficial channels. He had studied every report. He had run his own calculations at his kitchen table, with a pencil and a slide rule. And he had reached a conclusion that put him on a direct collision course with Vice Admiral Noble. The Hedgehog was not just effective, it was the future of anti-submarine warfare. Anyone who could not see that was a fool. And Frederick Walker did not suffer fools. Walker requested a meeting with Goodieve in April 1942. They did not meet at the Admiralty. They did not meet at any naval facility. They met in a pub in Portsmouth, far from official eyes and official ears, two men hunched over a small table in a dark corner. "I read what happened with Noble," Walker said, sliding a pint across the table. "The old man is fighting the last war. Half the Admiralty is fighting the last war. They will not change until U-boats are sinking ships in the Thames." "Then what do you suggest?" Goodeve asked. "My program is suspended. I cannot even requisition parts." Walker smiled. It was the kind of smile that had terrified German submarine commanders across the Atlantic. "Noble suspended the official program. He cannot suspend me. I am sailing in 3 weeks with my escort group. I want Hedgehogs on my ships." "That is impossible. The conversions would take months. You would need Admiralty approval, dockyard allocation, formal requisition orders." "I need 12 launchers ammunition and 3 days in dry dock. Can you provide that?" Goodeve stared at him. He understood exactly what Walker was proposing. This was not a test. This was insubordination. This was two men conspiring to defy a direct order from one of the most powerful officers in the Royal Navy. If Noble found out, both their careers were finished. Courts-martial. Disgrace. Prison, possibly. If Noble discovers this, "Let me worry about Noble. Can you provide the equipment?" Goodeve nodded slowly. "I can provide it." Walker grinned. "Then we have a deal. If this works, Noble will have no choice but to approve full deployment. And if it fails," he shrugged, "then we both find new careers." It was insane. It was the kind of decision that either wins medals or ends in handcuffs. There was no middle ground. The conversion happened in secret over the next 3 weeks. Goodeve personally supervised the installation on Walker's flagship HMS Dorado and 3 other sloops in the 2nd Escort Group. The work was done at night in a dockyard section that Walker had requisitioned under false pretenses for routine hull maintenance. Parts were ordered under fictitious project codes. Paperwork vanished into filing cabinets that would never be opened. Dockyard workers were told the unusual equipment was experimental sonar housing and instructed not to discuss it. Goodeve slept 3 hours a night for 21 consecutive days. He checked every launcher mount, calibrated every firing mechanism, tested every contact fuse by hand. If even one system failed during a real engagement, Noble would use it as proof that the Hedgehog was unreliable. There was no room for error. None. On May 14, 1942, Walker's 2nd Escort Group sailed from Liverpool to escort convoy HG-84 from Gibraltar, 4 warships, 4 Hedgehog launchers, 1 chance to prove everything or lose everything. The convoy consisted of 32 merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, and war material. German intelligence identified the route within 48 hours and dispatched a wolf pack of 9 U-boats to intercept. It was exactly the kind of scenario that had been destroying Allied convoys all year. Walker was counting on it. The first 3 days of the crossing were uneventful. Calm seas, light winds, no contacts. Walker paced the bridge of HMS Dorado like a caged animal. He needed the Germans to attack. Without combat proof, the Hedgehog program was dead, and Goodeve's career was over. On May 17th at 0342 hours, the waiting ended. HMS Dorado's ASTIC operator snapped to attention and called out in a voice tight with adrenaline. "Solid contact, bearing 245 degrees, range 1,200 yards. A submarine was positioning for a torpedo attack on the convoy's port flank. Walker ordered action stations. Every man on the ship moved to his position in the darkness. The night was black. Waves crashed against the hull. Wind howled across the open deck. On the forecastle, the Hedgehog launcher sat loaded and ready. 24 bombs pointing into nothing but cold, empty air. Walker watched the ASTIC display as the range closed. The submarine was running deep, approximately 180 feet, trying to position beneath the convoy where torpedoes would have the deadliest angle. Range 800 yards. Bearing steady. The submarine had no idea what was coming. Range 600 yards. Walker's hands gripped the bridge railing. He had spent his career making these attacks with depth charges. He knew the frustration of losing contact in the final seconds. He knew the hollow feeling of hearing explosions and seeing nothing but churned water. Every attack with depth charges ended the same way. Hope and silence. This time would be different. Range 400 yards. Target steady. Depth 180 feet. Fire Hedgehog. The launcher erupted with a sound like 24 hammers striking anvils simultaneously. The bombs arced into the black sky, spreading into their oval pattern, climbing to 60 feet above the ship before plunging toward the ocean. They hit the water and vanished. Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. On the bridge, Walker held his breath. Every man on the ship held his breath. The entire war held its breath. Crack, crack, crack. 3 detonations in rapid succession. Sharp, clean. Unlike anything anyone aboard had ever heard. Not the deep rolling thunder of depth charges that echoed and faded. These were instantaneous. Surgical. Final. On Azdic, the submarine contact shattered into static. Seconds later, debris broke the surface. Cork. Wood. Oil spreading in a dark slick across the black water. The unmistakable signature of a destroyed submarine. Walker checked his watch. Time from first contact to confirmed kill, 8 minutes. He turned to his first officer. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. Signal to convoy. 1 submarine destroyed. Resuming patrol station. But the night was far from over. At 04:27 hours, HMS Vetch reported another solid contact on the convoy's starboard quarter. Walker vectored in support. Hedgehog salvo. 2 cracks. Kill confirmed in 6 minutes. At 05:12 hours, HMS Gardenia found a 3rd submarine attempting to penetrate the escort screen from astern. Hedgehog salvo. 1 crack. Kill confirmed. At 05:58 hours, Walker himself engaged a 4th U-boat that had been shadowing the convoy from 2,000 yards. He closed the range, maintained Azdic lock, and fired. 4 cracks. The submarine disintegrated. By dawn on May 18th, 4 German submarines lay on the bottom of the Atlantic. Convoy HG-84 had not lost a single merchant ship. Not one. 4 U-boats destroyed in 6 hours, with 0 Allied casualties, 0 cargo lost, and a success rate that made every depth charge statistic in the Royal Navy look like a joke. Walker's after-action report reached the Admiralty 3 days later. It landed on Vice Admiral Noble's desk with the weight of a verdict. Noble read it in complete silence. 4 submarines destroyed. 6 hours. 100% kill rate on Hedgehog attacks. 0 losses. He set the report down. He picked up his telephone. He called the First Sea Lord. I am recommending immediate acceleration of the Hedgehog program. All available escort vessels are to be converted as quickly as resources allow. The order went out that afternoon. Within weeks, shipyards across Britain were pulling escort vessels from convoy duty and installing Hedgehog launchers around the clock. Training programs expanded overnight. Production facilities added 2nd and 3rd shifts. The weapon that had been suspended, dismissed, and nearly buried was suddenly the Royal Navy's highest priority. For Goodeve, it was vindication. But he did not celebrate. He knew that building the weapon was only half the battle. Captains who had survived the war on depth charges did not trust the new system. Some installed it and never fired it. Others used it incorrectly, firing at extreme ranges or losing Azdic contact before launch. Goodeve spent the next 18 months traveling to every major base in the Atlantic theater. He trained crews personally. He rowed escort ships on active convoy missions. He stood on bridges in freezing weather, demonstrating attack procedures to skeptical commanders who gradually reluctantly became believers. By mid-1943, the transformation was measurable. Hedgehog-equipped ships achieved kill rates 5 to 6 times higher than conventional escorts. U-boat losses skyrocketed. In 1942, the Allies had been losing the Battle of the Atlantic. By autumn 1943, they were winning it decisively. German submarine commanders began reporting encounters with a terrifying new weapon that killed without warning and offered no chance of escape. The Kriegsmarine called these reports propaganda at first, then isolated incidents. Then they stopped calling them anything because too many commanders were not coming home to file reports. But in January 1944, something happened that changed everything on the German side. A damaged U-boat limped into the port of Brest, France, carrying fragments of an unexploded Hedgehog bomb recovered from shallow water. German engineers worked around the clock to analyze it. They measured the contact fuse, they calculated the explosive yield, they mapped the pattern density. Their report to Admiral Karl Dönitz was devastating. The British had solved the fundamental problem of anti-submarine warfare. The blind spot was eliminated. The kill window was inescapable, and there was no effective countermeasure. Dönitz read the report and made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months earlier. He ordered his submarines to avoid contact with escort groups entirely. Attack only when conditions are absolutely favorable. Break off at the first sign of coordinated defense. It was an admission of defeat from the commander of the most feared submarine force in history. But Dönitz was not a man who surrendered easily. If individual wolf packs could no longer overwhelm convoy defenses, he would concentrate his forces. He would assemble the largest submarine group of the war and send them against a single convoy with orders to attack at all costs, accepting losses to break through the escort screen and reach the merchant ships. 7 Type 7 submarines. Veteran crews. Experienced commanders who had survived dozens of engagements. They were vectored toward convoy HX 286-47 merchant ships sailing eastward toward Liverpool on April 15, 1944. They had no idea that waiting for them was the most heavily armed anti-submarine force ever assembled in the North Atlantic. They had no idea that every escort ship carried Hedgehog launchers freshly calibrated and fully loaded. And they had no idea that in exactly 30 minutes, all 7 of their submarines would be crushed on the ocean floor, and 231 of their crewmen would be dead. In Part 3, we will witness the most devastating half-hour in the history of submarine warfare. We will stand on the bridge of HMS Swale as Commander Rowley tracks U-448 through black water. We will hear 28 contact detonations echo across the Atlantic in rapid succession. We will watch 7 submarines die one after another in a killing spree so fast and so total that Admiral Dönitz himself called the report a lie. And we will see the moment when the most feared submarine fleet in history realized that the ocean had turned against them. The hunters had become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to hide. In Part 1, Charles Goodeve, a civilian engineer with no military authority, designed a weapon that admirals called impossible. In Part 2, he fought a political war inside the Royal Navy, and won thanks to Captain Frederick Walker, who risked his career on a secret, unauthorized mission that destroyed 4 U-boats in a single night. The Admiralty reversed course. Production accelerated, training expanded. By early 1944, Hedgehog launchers were installed on hundreds of escort vessels across the Atlantic Fleet. But when German intelligence finally understood what they were facing, the response was immediate and desperate. In the first 3 months of 1944, Germany lost 62 submarines. That was more than double the losses from the same period the year before. Something catastrophic had changed beneath the waves. And now, Admiral Karl Dönitz was about to gamble everything on one massive concentrated assault against a single convoy. This was no longer an experiment. This was total war. And the next 30 minutes would decide who owned the Atlantic. The first captured Hedgehog fragments arrived at German naval research facilities in Kiel in February 1944. A damaged U-boat had limped into Brest, carrying pieces of an unexploded bomb recovered from shallow water near the Irish coast. Engineers worked around the clock to reverse engineer the weapon. They disassembled the contact fuse mechanism under microscopes. They measured the Torpex explosive charge grain by grain. They calculated the projected pattern density using captured British convoy formation data. Their conclusions terrified the Kriegsmarine High Command. The weapon eliminated the blind spot that had protected submarines for 26 years. It maintained sonar contact until the instant of attack, and the contact fuse meant there was no warning, no rumble of depth charges sinking through the water, no time to react, just silence, then death. Dönitz demanded countermeasures. His engineers proposed rubber coatings to absorb ASDIC pulses. The coatings reduced speed by 3 knots and shredded apart in rough seas. They proposed deeper diving modifications. Deeper meant slower, and slower meant easier to track. They proposed acoustic decoys to confuse sonar operators. The decoys were unreliable and nearly impossible to deploy while under attack. Every proposed solution created a new problem. The mathematics offered no escape. In March 1944, Dönitz issued new tactical orders to every submarine commander in the Atlantic. Avoid contact with escort groups. Attack only when conditions are absolutely favorable. Break off at the first sign of coordinated defense. For the first time in the war, German U-boats were being told to run rather than fight. The most feared submarine force in history was being ordered to hide. But Dönitz was not a man who accepted defeat. If dispersed wolf packs could no longer overwhelm convoy defenses, he would concentrate his forces into a single massive fist and punch through the escort screen with sheer numbers. Accept losses, sacrifice boats, but reach the merchant ships and prove that the Atlantic still belonged to the Kriegsmarine. But this was not the only crisis threatening the Hedgehog program. Success had created problems that Goodeve never anticipated. Mass production introduced quality control failures. Launchers manufactured at 3 different factories had slightly different tolerances, which meant firing patterns varied unpredictably between ships. Contact fuses from one supplier had a failure rate of 14%, nearly double the acceptable threshold. In February 1944, a Hedgehog bomb detonated prematurely aboard HMS Woodpecker during a routine loading exercise, killing 2 sailors and injuring 7. The accident sent shockwaves through the escort fleet. Captains who had reluctantly accepted the new weapon now questioned its safety. Was the Hedgehog more dangerous to its own crews than to enemy submarines? Vice Admiral Max Horton, who had replaced Noble as Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, ordered a safety review. For 2 weeks, Hedgehog operations were suspended on 12 ships pending investigation. 2 weeks during which U-boats operated without facing the weapon they feared most. Goodeve traced the problem to a batch of defective fuse assemblies from a subcontractor in Birmingham. He personally inspected 3,000 fuses, rejected 340, and redesigned the safety mechanism to prevent premature detonation. The fix worked. Operations resumed. But the incident had cost time, trust, and 2 lives. Critics inside the Admiralty whispered that the weapon was too fragile for sustained fleet operations. That depth charges, crude as they were at least, did not explode on their own ships. Goodeve said nothing publicly. He fixed the problem and moved forward. There was no time for arguments, because on April 8, 1944, convoy HX-286 departed New York Harbor and 7 German submarines were already moving to intercept it. The convoy was massive, 47 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns stretching across miles of open ocean. They carried food, fuel, ammunition, and machinery for the Allied war effort. The cargo was worth millions of pounds. The 1,400 men aboard were irreplaceable. The escort group consisted of 6 warships, every one of them equipped with Hedgehog launchers, freshly calibrated, fully loaded, and crewed by men who had trained specifically for coordinated anti-submarine operations. Dönitz had personally selected 7 Type 7 submarines for the intercept. These were not green crews on their first patrol. U-448 under helmet Doubter had completed 6 war patrols and survived 37 depth charge attacks. U-473 under Heinz Sternberg was known throughout the Kriegsmarine for aggressive close-range torpedo tactics. U-10001, U-392, U-515, U-731, and U-856 completed the Wolfpack. 49 officers, 282 enlisted men, 7 steel tubes carrying torpedoes that could snap a merchant ship in half. They positioned themselves in a patrol line across the convoy's projected path, spaced 10 miles apart, waiting in the dark water, like wolves at a mountain pass. They had survived everything the Royal Navy had thrown at them for years. They believed they would survive this too. 3 days into the crossing, a winter storm scattered the convoy formation across 20 miles of churning ocean. 2 merchant ships suffered structural damage. The escort commander ordered the convoy to regroup, which cost 2 days and gave the German submarines time to refine their positions. By April 14th, the Wolfpack was directly in the convoy's path. At 23:47 hours on April 14th, HMS Dorado reported a fleeting ASDIC contact bearing 315 degrees. Escorts investigated. The contact disappeared. A probing action. The Germans were testing response times, measuring gaps in the escort screen, choosing their moment. Then came the morning of April 15th. 08:47 hours. HMS Swale. Commander James Rowley is on the bridge. A SDIC operator calls contact. Bearing 220 degrees. Range 1,400 yards. Solid return. No ambiguity. Submarine. Rowley brings Swale around. Speed 15 knots. Closing. Below the surface, U-448 is positioning for a torpedo run on the convoy's left flank. Commander Doubter has done this dozens of times. He knows the rhythm. He knows when depth charges come. He knows how to twist away in the final seconds when the attacking ship goes blind. He does not know about the Hedgehog. Range 800 yards. ASDIC contact firm. Depth 200 feet. Range 600 yards. Target maneuvering. Coming shallow. Range 400 yards. Rowley gives the order. Fire Hedgehog. 24 bombs arc into the gray sky. They spread into their elliptical pattern. They reach apex at 60 feet. They fall. They pierce the surface and vanish into black water. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Crack. 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 3 contact detonations rip through U-448's pressure hull. The first bomb strikes near the bow. The second hits amidships and ruptures the control room. The third penetrates the engine compartment. Seawater floods in at crushing pressure. The hull folds. The lights die. 44 men are dead before anyone can reach an escape hatch. On the surface, Rowley watches oil and debris boil up from the depths. Time from contact to kill 8 minutes. Signal convoy. 1 submarine destroyed. Continuing patrol. 09:03 hours. HMS Dorado reports new contact. Bearing 045 degrees. Range 100 yards. U-473. Commander Sternberg has heard the attack on U-448 through his hydrophones. He heard the cracks. He heard the silence that followed. He orders emergency dive and maximum speed. It does not save him. Dorado closes range. ASDIC lock holds. Hedgehog fires. 2 bombs strike U-473. 1 near the conning tower. 1 in the battery compartment. The pressure hull cracks in 3 places. Sternberg orders emergency surface. The submarine breaks through the waves at a steep angle. Men scramble onto the listing deck. They have seconds. They do not have seconds. U-473 slides backward and sinks. 12 men make it into the water. All 12 die of hypothermia within 20 minutes. Time from contact to kill 11 minutes. 0919 hours. HMS Dorado destroys U-10001. Single salvo. 2 cracks. Dead. 0923 hours. HMS Dean catches U-392 attempting to dive beneath the convoy. 3 contact detonations. The submarine implodes at 220 feet. 0927 hours. Dorado scores again. U-515 at 280 feet. 1 crack. Enough. 0931 hours. Dorado and Dean coordinate a simultaneous attack on U-731. Both ships fire. 7 bombs strike the submarine from 2 angles. It disintegrates. Pieces of the hull surface minutes later. 0937 hours. The last one. U-856. Running silent at 300 feet. Deeper than any Type 7 was designed to operate. The crew believes they are safe. The ocean is vast. The darkness is absolute. No weapon can reach them here. HMS Swales, A.S.D. I. Sea operator detects a faint return. He tracks it for 4 minutes, adjusting, confirming, never losing the signal. Rowley positions his ship with surgical precision. The Hedgehog salvo drops through 300 feet of freezing water. 1 bomb strikes U-856's upper hull. At that depth, the ocean does the rest. The explosion breaches the pressure hull, and 300 feet of water pressure does what no explosive could. The entire submarine collapses inward in less than 1 second. 40 men crushed into nothing. Time 0937 hours. 7 submarines destroyed. 30 minutes elapsed. 231 German sailors dead. 0 merchant ships lost. 0 Allied casualties. 0. Commander Rowley stood on the bridge of HMS Swale and watched the last oil slick spread across the gray Atlantic. He wrote in his journal that evening, 7 boats in half an hour. The mathematics of this war have changed forever. The news detonated across the Allied Naval Command like a shockwave. 7 submarines in 30 minutes. The numbers seemed impossible. Admiral Dönitz received the report on April 17th and threw it across his desk. "The British cannot destroy 7 submarines in half an hour," he said. "This is propaganda." It was not propaganda. The impact was immediate and measurable. Escort commanders who had been skeptical demanded Hedgehog installation within days. Production facilities added night shifts. Within 3 months, every escort vessel in the Atlantic carried the weapon. The statistics told the story of a war transformed. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships. In 1943, with limited Hedgehog deployment losses, fell to 597. In 1944, with full deployment losses, collapsed to 205. Meanwhile, German submarine casualties exploded. 237 U-boats destroyed in 1943, 241 in 1944. The casualty rate among German submariners reached 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the entire war. Dönitz's response was an admission of total defeat. Suspend offensive operations in the North Atlantic pending tactical review. The Wolfpack era was over. The strategy that had nearly starved Britain into submission was finished. The supply lines that fed the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 were secured not by battleships or aircraft carriers, but by small escort vessels carrying a weapon that weighed less than a man and was designed by a civilian who had never seen combat. Vice Admiral Max Horton sent a personal communication to Charles Goodeve. The message contained 2 words, "You won." Between 1943 and 1945, Hedgehog-equipped ships confirmed 47 German submarine kills and 6 Japanese submarine kills. 53 enemy vessels destroyed. More than 5,000 enemy sailors killed. But the defensive impact dwarfed even those numbers. Conservative estimates suggest the Hedgehog directly or indirectly protected more than 2 million tons of shipping in the final 2 years of the war. At the standard calculation of 1 merchant sailor per 100 tons of cargo, that represents 20,000 lives saved. 20,000 men who came home because a civilian engineer refused to accept that depth charges were good enough. Goodeve received the Order of the British Empire. Captain Frederick Walker was promoted and continued hunting submarines until his death from a stroke on July 9, 1944, at age 48. 3 years of constant combat had worn out his heart. Walker was buried with full naval honors. His name appears in textbooks and museums around the world. Goodeve's name appears almost nowhere. The battle beneath the waves was won. The Hedgehog had changed submarine warfare forever. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. But the story has one final chapter that almost no one knows. Because the man who saved 20,000 lives and changed the course of a world war was almost completely erased from history. And the reason why will surprise you. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to Charles Goodeve after the guns fell silent. We will learn why his name vanished from the history books while others took the credit. We will understand the strange quiet tragedy of a man who changed the world and then chose to disappear. And we will hear the words he spoke only once, 35 years later, when someone finally asked him if he felt bitter about being forgotten. The war was over, the weapon worked, the lives were saved, but the battle for memory was just beginning, and that battle Charles Goodeve would lose. In Part 1, Charles Goodeve, a civilian engineer from Manitoba who had never fired a weapon in combat, designed a forward-throwing mortar system that the entire Royal Navy called impossible. In Part 2, he fought a political war against Vice Admiral Percy Noble and won thanks to Captain Frederick Walker, who defied direct orders to prove the Hedgehog worked by destroying 4 U-boats in a single night. In Part 3, we witnessed the most devastating 30 minutes in submarine warfare history, when 7 German submarines were crushed on the ocean floor and 231 men died in rapid succession. The Hedgehog changed the Battle of the Atlantic. It saved 20,000 lives. It secured the supply lines that made D-Day possible. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This is the part of the story that almost no one knows. Because Charles Goodeve, the civilian engineer who changed the course of World War II, was almost completely erased from history. And the reason why has nothing to do with enemies or politics. It has to do with something far more unexpected. When the war ended in May 1945, Charles Goodeve was 41 years old. He had spent 4 years inside the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a deliberately boring name for one of the most creative weapons laboratories in British history. The Hedgehog was his masterpiece, but it was not his only contribution. He had developed degaussing systems that protected hundreds of ships from German magnetic mines. He had created new methods for clearing minefields that saved countless lives during amphibious operations. He had solved technical problems that no one else in the Admiralty could crack, often working 18-hour days in a cramped laboratory while bombs fell on London outside his window. For his service, Goodeve received the Order of the British Empire in 1943. He was given the rank of Commander in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He received letters of commendation from admirals who had once laughed at his ideas, including one from a retired Percy Noble, who wrote a single awkward paragraph, acknowledging that the Hedgehog had exceeded initial expectations. That was as close to an apology as Noble ever came. But when the celebrations ended and the uniforms came off, Goodeve did not become a national hero. He did not write memoirs. He did not give lectures at military academies. He did not appear in newsreels or newspaper profiles. He walked away from everything connected to weapons and warfare and took a quiet position as director of the British Iron and Steel Research Association. A desk job, a civilian job, a job that had nothing to do with submarines explosions or saving lives at sea. The men who had fought alongside his invention received the recognition. Captain Frederick Walker, The rogue commander who had risked his career to prove the Hedgehog worked was celebrated as the greatest anti-submarine warrior in Royal Navy history. His name appeared in textbooks. Museums displayed artifacts from his ships. Documentaries told his story. But Walker never saw the war's end. He died of a stroke on July 9, 1944, at the age of 48. 3 years of relentless combat, sleepless patrols, and the crushing weight of command had destroyed his heart. He was buried with full naval honors at Liverpool Cathedral. Thousands attended. Admirals wept. Vice Admiral Percy Noble, the man who had tried to kill the Hedgehog program and delay its deployment by 18 months, retired in 1945 with a distinguished service record. He spent his remaining years writing about naval strategy. In his memoirs, he mentioned the Hedgehog in a single paragraph and took no responsibility for the thousands of sailors who died while he blocked its adoption. He passed away in 1955, remembered as a fine officer and a gentleman. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the German commander who had called the Hedgehog reports propaganda and refused to believe that his invincible submarines were being slaughtered by a weapon designed by a civilian, survived the war. He was convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg and served 10 years in Spandau prison. He never publicly acknowledged how completely Goodeve's invention had defeated his submarine force. He died in 1980, the same year as Goodeve, still insisting that the Kriegsmarine had fought honorably against overwhelming odds. Goodeve outlived them all. He worked quietly in industrial research for 35 years after the war. His obituary in 1980 mentioned his wartime service in passing. It did not mention the Hedgehog by name, but the legacy of what he built did not die with him. It grew. The Hedgehog remained in active frontline service with the Royal Navy until the early 1960s, nearly 20 years after the war ended. It was adopted by the United States Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, the French Navy, and more than a dozen other allied fleets around the world. Over 3,000 Hedgehog launchers were manufactured during and after the war. The weapon saw combat not only in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. The principles Goodeve pioneered did not end with the Hedgehog itself. They spawned an entire family of weapons that evolved across decades. The Squid system entered Royal Navy service in late 1944, using the same forward-throwing concept, but with larger 300-pound bombs, and an automated fire control system that calculated depth, range, and bearing simultaneously. The Squid achieved an even higher kill rate than the Hedgehog, and remained in service until the 1970s. The Limbo system introduced in the 1950s refined the concept further with triple-barreled mortars that could engage submarines at greater depths and longer ranges. Limbo equipped warships from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. It remained operational in the Royal Navy until 1992, nearly 50 years after Goodeve first sketched his oval bomb pattern on a chalkboard. The modern descendants of the Hedgehog are even more lethal. The American ASROC system, deployed since the 1960s, fires rocket-propelled torpedoes to submarine locations while maintaining continuous sonar tracking until the moment of impact. The Australian Ikara system used similar principles with guided flight paths. Today's vertical launch systems on destroyers and frigates can deliver precision-guided anti-submarine munitions with accuracy that Goodeve could only have dreamed of. But the core doctrine remains exactly what he proposed in 1941. Maintain contact attack forward, achieve precision. Every modern anti-submarine warship in every navy on Earth operates on principles that a Canadian-born civilian physicist invented in a cramped British laboratory during the darkest year of the war. Between 1943 and 1945. Hedgehog-equipped ships confirmed 47 German submarine kills and 6 Japanese submarine kills. 53 enemy vessels sent to the bottom. More than 5,000 enemy sailors killed. But the true measure of the weapon's impact was not in what it destroyed. It was in what it protected. 2 million tons of shipping saved. 20,000 merchant sailors who came home alive. supply lines secured for the invasion of Normandy, food, fuel, and ammunition delivered to a nation that was weeks away from starvation. But the biggest lesson of Charles Goodyeve's story is not about technology. It is about the nature of innovation itself. Every institution, whether it is a navy, a corporation, a government, or a hospital, develops resistance to change over time. The people who mastered the old system do not want to learn a new one. The commanders who built their careers on depth-charge tactics did not want to hear that their methods were failing. The admirals who had spent decades perfecting convoy escort doctrine did not want a civilian engineer telling them they were wrong. This resistance is not stupidity. It is human nature. People invest their identities in their expertise. When someone challenges that expertise, it feels like a personal attack. Naval did not hate the Hedgehog because he was evil. He hated it because accepting the Hedgehog meant admitting that 26 years of depth-charge doctrine had been killing sailors unnecessarily. That is a terrible thing to accept. Most people never do. Goodyeve's genius was not purely technical, it was political. He understood that proving a weapon works in a laboratory is not enough. You have to prove it in the field under conditions that skeptics cannot dismiss. You have to find allies who are willing to risk their careers alongside yours. And you have to be patient enough to let results speak louder than arguments. This pattern repeats across military history with astonishing consistency. The tank was dismissed as a useless curiosity by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. Radar was rejected by admirals who trusted their lookouts more than electronic boxes. The machine gun was opposed by generals who believed bayonet charges would always be decisive. Jet engines were resisted by experts who insisted propellers were the only viable propulsion technology. In every case, the innovation eventually won. In every case, the delay cost lives that did not need to be lost. The same pattern exists far beyond the military. Every breakthrough in medicine, technology, business, and science has faced institutional resistance from people who benefited from the existing system. The question is never whether the old guard will resist. They always will. The question is whether the innovator has the persistence, the allies, and the evidence to overcome that resistance before it is too late. Goodyeve had all three. And 20,000 men lived because of it. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. In 1979, 1 year before his death, Charles Goodyeve was contacted by a researcher from the Imperial War Museum who was compiling an oral history of the Battle of the Atlantic. The classification restrictions on the Hedgehog program had finally been lifted after 35 years. For the first time since 1944, Goodyeve was free to speak publicly about what he had done. He agreed to the interview. He was 75 years old. His voice was quiet. His memory was precise. For 2 hours, he described the early failures, the political battles with Naval, the secret nights in the dockyard with Walker, and the morning he received the report that 7 submarines had been destroyed in 30 minutes. He spoke without bitterness. He spoke without pride. He spoke like a man describing work that needed to be done, and so he had done it. The researcher asked the question that had been waiting for 35 years. Mr. Goodyeve, do you feel bitter about being forgotten? Others received the credit. Others are in the history books. Your name is barely known. Goodyeve's response was recorded on tape and preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives in London. He said, "I designed a machine. The men who operated that machine in freezing water, in hurricane winds, against an enemy who wanted to kill them, they are the ones who won the battle. I sat in a laboratory. They sailed into hell. There is no comparison." He paused. Then he added something that captures the soul of everything he believed. Besides, the best weapons are the ones that make themselves unnecessary. By 1944, the Germans feared the Hedgehog so much that they stopped attacking convoys. Ships arrived safely, not because we sank submarines, but because submarines were afraid to fight. That is victory. That is what I wanted. Not medals, not recognition, just ships arriving safely. Charles Goodyeve died on April 3, 1980. He was 76 years old. His funeral was attended by family and colleagues from his post-war research career. No admirals were present. No military honors were rendered. No flags flew at half-mast. The man who had changed submarine warfare forever was buried as what he had always been, a civilian. But in naval academies around the world, his principles are still taught to young officers who have never heard his name. In shipyards on 5 continents, weapons based on his designs are still manufactured and deployed. In the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, the wrecks of 53 submarines destroyed by his invention still rest on the ocean floor, silent monuments to a weapon that admirals called impossible, and a man who proved them wrong. From a civilian engineer with an idea that the Royal Navy called insane to a weapon that destroyed 53 enemy submarines, saved 20,000 merchant sailors, and changed the outcome of the deadliest war in human history. Charles Goodeve proved that innovation does not require rank. It does not require authority. It does not require permission. It requires persistence. It requires allies willing to risk everything alongside you. And it requires the courage to challenge experts who insist that the old ways are the only ways. 7 submarines, 30 minutes, 231 enemy sailors dead, 0 Allied casualties, 0 merchant ships lost. That is what one man with one idea accomplished when he refused to accept that good enough was good enough. If you know similar stories of forgotten innovators who changed history, share them in the comments below. The world is full of Charles Goodeves, whose names never made the history books, but whose ideas shaped the world we live in. This is just one of hundreds of innovations that changed World War II. Subscribe to discover more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their nations needed them most. Because history is not made only by generals and admirals. It is made by engineers, mechanics, physicists, and ordinary people who refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. And sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is not a bomb or a torpedo or a battleship. It is simply the willingness to ask one dangerous question. What if everyone else is wrong?